Now, Professor Thomas Hill is an expert on Gaza. He is with the Committee on Global Thought and Center for Palestinian Studies at Columbia University, but he's visiting UC Berkeley this semester, and he joins me here tonight. Thank you so much for coming.
Thanks for having me.
Let's start. Well, what's your reaction to this ceasefire agreement? As they mentioned, it's not a long-term solution, but at least it kind of gets things to de-escalate for the time being.
Right. So as your reporter just said, it is very much a ceasefire and not a peace deal. So it's far too early to tell how different this will be from previous times. It sounds a lot like the ceasefire that ended the previous war 4 years ago, and like various ceasefires that have been negotiated since. So we really have to wait and see on the substance of this. From what I've seen so far, the main danger seems to be that, as often, it's a two-part agreement in which Hamas pledges to stop rocket launching and Israel promises to lift restrictions on movement in and out of Gaza at some time in the future. Now, that's always a dangerous setup for any kind of ceasefire, since it's conditioned on behavior down the road. And so that's going to be the test of the deal fairly quickly. Yeah,
let's talk a little bit about looking at this longer term. It seems like part of the issue might be that a lot of nations, including Israel, classify Hamas as a terror group. So I heard one Israeli diplomat say that they can't legally negotiate with them. A lot of countries prefer not to negotiate with them. So how does that work as we go forward?
Well, it's very difficult. We're back in the same position in some ways as we were before the 90s, when Israel would not talk to the PLO and everything had to go through other channels. In this case, the change has been the Arab Spring. So in these negotiations, Israel and Hamas didn't talk directly to each other. They talked to each other through the Egyptian government, which is a very, very big change and is the one thing that might make this ceasefire deal stick, if anything does. The actors are slightly different from last time. And Egypt, the new Egypt, is a strong actor if it wants to be. The joke used to be that in the Oslo peace process negotiations, America was acting as Israel's lawyer. Well, let's say that Gaza now has a lawyer on its side in the person of Egypt. And so we now have two pretty tough lawyers battling it out behind each of the main actors. So that may be something of a paradigm shift.
What can you tell us? I want to talk about that a little bit more, because Mohamed Morsi, now the head in Egypt, and he's much more sympathetic to Hamas. I think a lot of pressure was on him to broker some kind of a deal. He's right in the thick of it, and at least for now, it looks like he was successful.
Right. Now, one of the issues for him is he announced 2 days ago that there would be a ceasefire by midnight, and there wasn't, apparently because Israel posed an objection to a term of the ceasefire deal. And it's always embarrassing when you're a political leader to say there will be a ceasefire and then there isn't. So it's unlikely he would have enjoyed that. But he is the main player in bringing this about. There's no doubt about that at all. This eventually came out, I believe, after Hillary Clinton got to Cairo to finalize the details with him. Things go through Egypt these days, and it's the first time in a long time that's been the way. The latest New York Times story appears to say that President Obama and President Morsi have forged some kind of rapport over thumping out the details of this deal. And if that's true, that's quite promising for the way in which future flare-ups will be dealt with, if the actors start to know each other better and start to be able to wind crises down rather faster than before. But Egypt is the indispensable nation at this point in this context.
What about Iran's role? Everybody's been talking about Iran is more involved in this, that they're giving more rockets and better technology and assistance to Hamas. Some people would say that Gaza has kind of become just a forward base for Iran now to stage attacks. Do you think that that's the case at all? And what needs to be done to make sure that there can be peace and stability going forward?
Well, if Gaza is now a forward base for Iran, then it's a spectacularly ineffective forward base. I mean, the things that are being fired from Gaza are more powerful than they have been in the past, especially these Fajr 5 rockets, apparently, from Iran. There were very few of those fired. One of them reached Jerusalem. Many of them were shot down by Israel's Iron Dome system. So militarily, the balance of forces is not only nowhere near equal, it's basically 100 to 1. So it's not so much the military aspect as the symbolic aspect that is preoccupying, which is the fact that, as President Obama said the other day, no country on earth can have missiles raining down on its territory and do nothing about it. he was talking about Israel, but of course Gazans would feel much the same, that they can't simply have rather more developed missiles raining down on them without doing something in return. And this is what Iran provides some kind of symbolic counter to. Now, the role of Iran in this has been very overplayed in general, I tend to think. The chairman of Hamas, Khalid Mishal, I believe, just thanked Iran for its support in this process, which effectively means the provision of certain long-range missiles. But it's also true that, if you recall, a week ago when the military chief of Hamas was assassinated, sparking this off, immediately afterwards, Israel bombed these rocket launcher sites, most of them, to prevent these being fired in response. It had apparently tracked these for the year since they came from Iran through Sudan and various other places. So there is new weaponry in Gaza, but Israel knows where it is and it can deal with it if it needs to. So it's not so much a question of what do they have as why would they use it, and how do you set up a framework in which they don't need to use it?
Let's talk a little bit about that. I think from Israel's perspective, if rockets weren't being kind of lobbed in generally, sometimes almost day to day, if the rocket fire stopped, I think that they would seem to be somewhat happy. What needs to happen from the Palestinian side, from Hamas's perspective? What would they like out of Israel?
The very basics is what it has been for the years ever since 2006-07, when Israel began what's variously described as a blockade or a siege of the Gaza Strip, where all the borders are sealed, nothing gets in or out without Israel's wanting it. This has changed slightly, but only very slightly, since the Egyptian revolution, in that the border between Gaza and Egypt has been opened very slightly more, but still these are very small numbers, at most 400 people getting out, and that's purely passenger traffic. So what Gaza needs is a commercial crossing. That's first and last on Hamas's list of demands. That commercial crossing is going to be with Egypt eventually at some point, or through Israel with Egyptian coordination. But that's basically, without a commercial crossing somewhere down the line, it's a no-starter, and we'll be back where we started with this quite soon down the line. It's a complex question. Egypt doesn't want to take over responsibility for the Gaza Strip just because Israel wants it to do that. So the details are going to have to be worked out in very fine print indeed. But eventually, it's a lifting, a comprehensive and substantive lifting of the siege blockade that Gaza's been under for 5 years. Without that, we go nowhere.
What about some of these other groups? I mean, we've been talking about negotiations with Hamas, but there are other groups involved too, and to some extent, can Hamas control them? If Hamas says, hey, we're going to have a ceasefire, there are some other groups. Do they abide by it?
Well, this is the whole question, which is Hamas in the last few years has actually had as a priority to manage the rockets from Gaza. That's to say, to not have people fire rockets which are not in what it thinks the general Gazan interest is at this point. Now, rockets are very simple to make and quick to fire. You cannot stop all of them. It's simply not the way. All you can do is have a political solution within Gaza where factions agree that it is not in the Gazan interest to do this at this moment, let's say. That's probably as good as you're going to get. Now, the great irony of all this, of course, is that the one person within Hamas who could probably guarantee a cessation of fire, the head of the military wing of Hamas, the Azzedine al-Qassam brigades, is the guy who Israel assassinated last week, sparking all of this off. So I could predict to you how long this ceasefire will last, or that it will last at least a few months or years at this point. But I could only do that if Ahmed Jabari was alive, and he's not there to be the enforcer for this anymore. So it's not clear to me who is in a position to enforce this deal. Perhaps the head of Egyptian intelligence at this point is the best place to do that. But as so often in the past, while a long-term ceasefire was being negotiated, an assassination took place in Gaza, which has set that possibility back quite considerably.
Makes it very complicated. Dr. Thomas Hill, thank you so much. I know you're in the Bay Area for the semester, and we're happy to have you here and shed some perspective on this going forward.
Thank you for having me.